Richard Baldwin was a Texan that loved to race. After spending a decade winning at the local level, he got a few chances to race in NASCAR's top level, the Winston Cup. After seeing some success, he moved his family to North Carolina to chase his NASCAR dream. But shortly after, this dream would come to a terrible end. Following a horrible wreck at Michigan, Rick would fight for his life for 11 years. This is the terrible tragedy of Rick Baldwin. Right before we get into the video, leave a like if you enjoy, and subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss a video. Let me know down in the comments below if there are any stories you'd like me to cover in the future. Anyway, let's get right into it. Richard Baldwin was born on June 10, 1955 in Texas. Rick's father Jim was also a racer. From a young age, Rick was surrounded by racing. But Jim wasn't a full-time racer. Instead, he owned a roofing company which supported his racing efforts. Rick would go on to follow in his father's footsteps, roofing by day and racing by night. According to influential moments in racing, Rick and his dad went down to Mexico to compete in the Baja 1000. This was in 1971, so at just 16 years old, Rick himself was too young to compete. Instead, he'd help his dad out in the race by plotting the route and being on standby in case of a mechanical issue. By the next year, Rick started his own racing career. I will say, 17 years old was certainly early to be racing in the early 70s. Rick would make his debut at Cudahy Raceway. Amazingly, his debut would be the exact same night as Terry Labonte. Rick was about a year older than Texas Terry, and they were both born in the same exact town. The Tuscaloosa News wrote that Terry and Rick actually got into each other in their debut. Apparently, Terry got into Rick. That year at the track, the pair would win 3 races each, with the other finishing second. For a time, they were the two youngsters crowds came to see, but the two would have 2 completely different journeys. After the young teenagers battled it out in 1972 at the track, Terry Labonte would climb to the Winston Cup Series by 1978. On the other hand, Rick was left behind. He would race the local level for quite some time. As Terry was making moves in NASCAR, Rick was making moves in his personal life. Rick would marry Debbie Anderson in 1977. Over the next few years, he'd have 2 daughters with Debbie. Then, Rick would get his first big break. DK Ulrich would give the 26-year-old Texan his first opportunity to race in NASCAR in 1981 at Texas World Speedway. Now, this wasn't the Texas Motor Speedway we know and hate today, but a 2-mile superspeedway. This was a massive step up from local short tracks. Despite the challenge, Baldwin would finish 21st after blowing an engine late in the race. In 1982, Baldwin would finish 12th in his second career start, entering his own car. In 1983, he qualified for the Daytona 500, where he finished a solid 20th place in the biggest race of his career. After suffering mechanical issues in a few more races in the same year, he had finished 13th place at Rockingham. Now, all of this was super impressive. Baldwin went from racing short tracks to finishing top 15 in his own equipment in stock car's highest level of racing. The guy could race, and had a little bit of money from the roofing business. This money would only allow him to race a few times a year, so he'd need some more help to really get his career going. And that's when Baldwin decided to move his family to North Carolina in 1985. This was to commit entirely to this NASCAR thing. He obviously wanted to race a bunch more. The family kept their home back in Texas, but I assume the plan was to live in North Carolina during the NASCAR season, then go back during the off-season. After this move, Baldwin got a few opportunities to race in 1986 for Elmo Langley. Then Rick got another call. Buddy Arrington suffered a nasty wreck at Pocono. He was injured, so he would need a relief driver for Michigan the following week. So that's when Rick got the call to drive. This was a great opportunity. It was a new opportunity, and he wasn't racing in his own equipment. But in qualifying for that race, tragedy struck. Baldwin lost control of his car in turn 1, where it went into a spin. The car hit driver's side first into the barrier and slid down the banking of the track. Rick would sit in his car for 28 minutes, completely unconscious, with a severed spinal cord. Although the jaws of life were used to cut the car, it still took nearly half an hour to remove him from the car. He was then taken to W.T. Foote Memorial Hospital for emergency surgery to relieve pressure on his brain. Now, Baldwin had technically survived the wreck, but fell into a coma. He was given the slimmest chance of survival, some sources stating 1%. In the following days of the accident, while some were amazed that he was alive, others were questioning the cause of the severe injury. I mean, it didn't look serious at all. Rick's wife, among others, would question NASCAR's safety features in the coming years. But before we get into that, let's talk about Baldwin's journey. A few months after his accident, Baldwin was transferred to a nursing home back in his home state of Texas. A grueling 2 years would go by before Baldwin was off life support. Then, 2 more years later, Debbie, Rick's wife, would sue NASCAR. At this point, Baldwin had been in a coma for 4 years. Debbie filed a $50 million lawsuit against NASCAR, saying that the NASCAR-mandated window netting did not protect the driver from injury. It was said and assumed by many that Rick's head hit the outside wall, meaning that the window net failed. So you can't tell from the camera angle of the wreck, so it was definitely a hard case to make. Although the Baldwin family had an outpour of support from friends and fellow drivers in the community, NASCAR didn't really do anything. There was no communication with the family, and no support outside of the initial $50,000 insurance policy NASCAR has on all of its drivers. And that money was definitely spent quickly because of the expenses that came with Rick's poor condition. In 1992, it was found that NASCAR was not liable for the death of Richard Baldwin. The years went on, and Debbie continued to emotionally, physically, and financially support her husband. The journey isn't documented well from what I've been able to find. Some sources state that he was in a full coma, others in a semi-coma. Some reports state that Rick was able to move his eyes and eyelids at times, while others make no mention. Regardless of the exact circumstances, it was definitely a ride for Rick's friends and family. Then, in 1997, Rick would pass away, 11 years after his accident. It was 2 days after his 42nd birthday. He had been in a coma since he was 31 years old. In the years leading up to his death, family members urged Debbie to divorce Rick for financial purposes, as it was evident Rick would never wake up. But she never did, and she cared for her husband every second until he passed. Rick's Michigan crash had happened right before his daughter Tiffany's 5th birthday. By the time Rick died, she was in high school. Tiffany and her sister would joke that their dad was setting the record for the longest nap to lighten the mood. In reality, the 2 daughters had been through a dreadful 11-year journey. After Rick passed, Michigan Speedway officials issued a statement, offering condolences for the family. Unfortunately, with as short of a stint Rick had in the NASCAR world, his death wouldn't be met with the response you would expect. Sadly, it was like he was forgotten about. Rick was a hardworking man, a fast racer, and a great husband. After battling it out for a decade at the local level, he raced in the NASCAR Winston Cup series, racing in the Daytona 500, and did great in his limited starts. He moved his family to North Carolina to chase this NASCAR dream, but unfortunately, he suffered that terrible crash at Michigan shortly into the journey. His family stood beside him, fighting for him for 11 years. And that's it for this video. I hope you guys did enjoy. This was a story I hadn't heard about until I started researching it, so I hope you learned something from it. Make sure you guys leave a like and subscribe so you never miss a video. Anyway, that's it for me. I'll see you guys in the next one. Peace.